Let's talk about health, because you have been discussing the idea that perhaps the government is going to review what was called a top-down reorganisation that was carried out when David Cameron was Prime Minister.
Yes.
Is there a sense that that is going?
There is, as part of a big promise the Prime Minister made in Easter, more resources and a new deal for the NHS. Part of that, as I understand it, is a very serious look at whether some of the very controversial and to a lot of people crazy and unpopular reforms that were pushed through under David Cameron, there is a possibility that some of those ideas might be stripped away or slimmed down. So the so-called Lansley reforms, as they were called, because the Health Secretary at the time was Andrew Lansley, they could be up for grabs. Now, sources I've been talking to are very clear. This is not the government about to embark on a huge new reorganisation of the health service, but they are looking at if bits and pieces of the laws as were brought in at that point, which have been criticised by many people for sort of splintering the NHS, putting it into too many different organisations. If it makes sense to tidy that up, to scrap bits of the legislation, then the government may well indeed be up for that. There were hugely controversial changes at the time. There will be a question about whether it would be disruptive to have another go. But as if by magic, the Health Select Committee happens to be looking at exactly this issue, and they'll be reporting on that in a couple of weeks. And I get the sense if they make recommendations to change bits of the legislation, that the government would give that a fair wind.
If the government is discussing and looking at the whole future in terms of health funding, would this be an ideal opportunity for you and some of your colleagues to start pressing for that extra money to go to the NHS that was promised during the EU referendum campaign?
Yes, it would. I think that political promises are not subject to footnotes and caveats, and that because it said on the side of the bus £350 million a week extra for the NHS, and because people voted to leave, I think that crystallised in people's mind as a firm political promise, and I think the government should deliver it. And I've said that several times before. I think that politicians are a very difficult ground when they say, if you look at the riders I add in, if you look at the small print, I didn't really mean that promise. It was an if, it was a possibility. I don't think voters look at it like that. I think they say, this was promised, this should be delivered. And I happen to think the NHS also needs the money.
Has the government given you any indication that they will do that?
No.
Right. And what are you going to do
what
to
I have
pressure?
heard, I mean, I've heard on the grapevine, and this is political gossip, that there will be 3% real funding for the NHS, and this is going back to nearer to where we were historically.
There is, of course, a big other fight, not just about the legislation, but between number 10, number 11 and the Department of Health about how much money they can actually come up with. From the Department of Health's view, they are hopeful of something around 3%, as I understand it. But then you talk to people in government who are more hawkish on this, who say, look, the money's got to come from somewhere. So do people want to pay more tax? The government doesn't want to ask people to pay more tax. Therefore, what are you going to do? Because if more money goes to the health service, as such a huge organisation, of course, the question has to be, where is it going to come from? Is it going to come from the MOD, or is it going to come from the Department for Education? And I have to also, I think, just come back on what Rees Mogg said about the 350 million. A lot of people say that your campaign didn't provide caveats to the 350 million, so it's a bit rich for you to be demanding that number 10 fulfills the promise that your side of the campaign made, when that's not a promise that Theresa May made, and it's not a promise that the Remain campaign accepted.
I think political promises are created by the election result rather than by who made them, and that created an expectation because we voted to leave that was part of voting to leave. And I don't think the Prime Minister can hide around small print saying, well, I was on the Remain side, so I definitely didn't mean that. But 3% is interesting because between 79 and 97, under tough Tory years, spending in real terms on the NHS increased by 3.4%. From 2010, it's been by 1%, but with a much more rapidly growing population. So there has been, even from somebody like me who's fiscally dry, a real squeeze in real terms per capita NHS expenditure, and that can't go on indefinitely.
Laura, thank you.
Pleasure.